Okay, everyone. We'll just make a start. Welcome everyone to the second meeting of the Transport and Urban Development Committee. We're running a hybrid meeting due to COVID-19 today, so this means there's no public gallery at the meeting. So the meeting is going to be recorded and made available on the ECAN website in the next few days. And just a reminder to those members who are joining us online, and I have a feeling that Tumatayo in Cranwell will probably join us online, and possibly Councillor Farm. Just to use the chat function to speak or question, raise your hand in that. And we have a quorum, and I'm pleased to declare the meeting open. I'd like to invite Councillor Pauling to open the meeting with a karakia. That'd be great.
Tēnā koe, Councillor Edge. Ai, e karakia tīmatanga o tātou hei hui. A tūkua taku wairua kia rere ki ka taumata. Hei arahi o tō tātou mahi, me tō tātou whai ka tauka o nehi. Kia mau, kia ita, kia kore ai e karo, kia pupuru, kia whakamaua, kia tīna, haumi e hui e tākie.
Thanks very much, Craig. Apologies, we have an apology from Councillor Farm, Tumatayo Yvette Couch-Lewis and Chair Jenny Huey, and I'm expecting Tumatayo Yang Cranwell to join us online at some point soon. Are there any other apologies? No other apologies. But let me lateness. Are there any conflicts of interest? No conflicts of interest. There are no requests for public forum, deputations or petitions that we've received. No. None. So what we'll do now is we'll just to go into look at the minutes of the previous meeting, which is on page 12. Just wondered if there are any matters of accuracy relating to the minutes of the meeting for the 1st of July. Nothing anybody's got. So the recommendation then is that the committee confirms and adopts as true and correct record the minutes of the meeting held on the 1st of July. And do I have a mover for that? Councillor Scott, thank you very much. The seconder? Councillor Clearwater? All those in favour, you say aye? Aye. Those opposed, no? Carried. Are there any matters arising from the previous minutes? No matters arising. Thank you very much. So we have a couple of decision items to make, and the first one that we're looking at, which is on page 19, is a report on the Greater Christchurch Housing Development Capacity Assessment. And if I could invite, basically, or just the purpose of this particular thing is to basically report to the committee to receive the Greater Christchurch Housing Development Capacity Assessment. And I'd like to invite Sam Bellamy to explain briefly the paper. And Andrew Parrish as well. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you, Mr. Chair. So this report is coming to you today to provide the committee, as mentioned, the Greater Christchurch Housing Development Capacity Assessment, which has been jointly prepared by the councils in Greater Christchurch, that being, of course, Christchurch City Council, Selwyn and Waimakariri District Councils, and Environment Canterbury. This assessment has been jointly prepared by the councils to satisfy the requirements of the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, which requires such an assessment to be jointly produced by councils for the Greater Christchurch area. Broadly speaking, the purpose of this assessment is to estimate the type and location of demand for housing expected in the future, and to compare this against the sufficiency of the development capacity that's going to be available over the next 3, 10 and 30 years. So simply put, the intention of the assessment is to check whether there is enough housing capacity planned and provided for to meet future demands. I think it's really important to acknowledge that this is a point in time assessment and that there can be some uncertainties when looking at housing demand and supply, particularly when looking across a longer term period such as 30 years. And that's why the National Policy Statement requires such assessments to be undertaken and updated every 3 years. This is the second one that's been undertaken for Greater Christchurch. The first one back in 2018 by the Partnership under the previous National Policy Statement on Urban Development Capacity. Yes. There's also a requirement to continue to do ongoing monitoring of key housing market indicators. The key findings from this particular assessment are set out in your report in paragraphs 11 to 18 on pages 21 to 23. The key finding that I will particularly note is that the assessment indicates that there is enough housing capacity in the Greater Christchurch area as a whole over the next 30 years. However, there may be some shortfalls in housing capacity in the Selwyn and Waimakere districts over this period, and the difference for Greater Christchurch being the significant surplus in housing capacity in the Christchurch area, due really to the significant upzoning that occurred during the Christchurch district plan process a few years ago. This housing capacity assessment will now represent a really key piece of evidence to inform the spatial planning work that the Greater Christchurch Partnership is progressing. And this will include, of course, ensuring that the right type of housing is being provided in the right locations to meet both current and future demands, which we know are changing, given changing households and demographic makeup. The other key next steps are also set out in paragraphs 29 to 31. Further work is going to be undertaken to continue to enhance the information contained in the assessment. This includes undertaking more work to understand the demand for papakāinga housing in the Greater Christchurch area. We need to incorporate housing bottom lines into the regional policy statement and into the respective district plans. And partner council staff are currently looking into this and will come back to elected members with some advice. And finally, work will now commence on the business development capacity assessment, which is also a key requirement from the National Policy Statement. This assessment was completed and published on the Greater Christchurch Partnership website on 30th of July, and that was to meet the National Policy Statement timeframes for this assessment to be completed by 31st of July this year. As mentioned, the Greater Christchurch Partnership Committee also considered and received this assessment at their last meeting, or at that meeting on the 13th of August. So with that said, and through you, Mr. Chair, I refer you to the recommendations, which are outlined on page 19 of the report, and as mentioned, the key one being that this committee receives the Greater Christchurch Housing Development Capacity Assessment. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Sam. Are there any questions of clarification people have? Councillor Scott.
Thank you, and this will be for clarification. I got carried away in the last meeting. So, Sam, my question to you, I guess, is that this informs hopefully the RPS, which will give some strength to the way the urban development strategy should take place. How strong will the RPS need to be in terms of its direction, and are there enough instruments in that, for clarity's sake, to ensure that what needs to happen happens?
Thank you, Councillor Scott. This piece of work will firstly inform the spatial plan for Greater Christchurch before then informing the regional direction that is contained within the RPS. A really good indication of what may come out of the work that's done in the spatial plan is actually contained in Chapter 6 of the Regional Policy Statement now, where Map A shows a settlement pattern for Greater Christchurch and new areas of greenfield priority, so new areas where new development can go, both in terms of business development and in terms of greenfield development. That's been absolutely critical for Christchurch and for the Canterbury region to maintain a lower than average annual house price growth. So we feel at a technical level that that type of strategic long-term urban planning, both through the spatial plan for Greater Christchurch and from the RPS, will serve us in good stead in the future to ensure there's enough housing capacity.
Just want a clarification then, Andrew. Thank you for that in terms of understanding the hierarchy and the way things have worked. So the Christchurch spatial plan, that this will inform the. Is there enough time to make sure that makes a difference? I mean, we sit around here and we look at urban development in terms of being the lever that makes us do a whole lot of things around transport and those other things in terms of services. And my observation, I guess, and I might be wrong on this, is that everybody finds a hole and looks for a hole, and then we get thwarted on this. So how confident are we that we've got this right, and how long before this actually starts to push people in the right direction?
What this capacity assessment says is that there is available capacity in Greater Christchurch in the short term, in the medium term, and in the long term. What this report also says is that in the medium and long term in our outlying districts, there may be a shortfall in capacity. This is a key piece of advice for you as a council in terms of where you signal for growth in those medium and long term areas. If there are localised areas where there is a shortfall, then there is the opportunity under the MPS urban development for developers to make private plan change requests, and there is somewhere in the realm of 20 of those private plan change requests occurring in Selwyn as we speak.
Councillor Sunkel.
Thanks, team, for this. I find it quite interesting. Recognise that yes, we have capacity in the current state for further development, and recognise that into the future we may be constrained, maybe in Selwyn and Waimakariri, which I guess reduces opportunity for choice. My question, given the current state within New Zealand of a housing crisis as is seen, and the awareness that within our Greater Christchurch area, the LERP and the availability of land has kept prices down. Do you believe that we genuinely have enough land available to maintain that reduction or reduction in price or cost across Canterbury with providing choice? And I note that Christchurch properties are cheaper than Selwyn, which are more accessible. But I don't have any indication whether they're 4-bedroom, 5-bedroom quality and rent. So do we have an understanding, given the current and near future challenge of housing, whether we have enough land available to keep a lid on those costs, given the requirement for houses?
I mean, that's a really good question. And it's not just about providing the number of homes that you need to meet demand, but it's how you keep it capping it at a level that housing affordability remains affordable for people. This particular assessment shows how much we need to meet future demand, and it shows that we have got enough land across Greater Christchurch to provide that, with some localised issues in Selwyn and Waimakariri. I'd make the point that just because we have the capacity and the land doesn't mean that we're going to be meeting the type of housing that future generations are going to be needing. And whilst in the city we might be seeing that shift towards smaller places, medium density, that is going to need to also be seen in other parts of Greater Christchurch to make sure that the needs of smaller households to afford places that are going to meet their needs are going to be able to be met. So I think can be a bit misleading to just look at the numbers and say, yes, tick, we have enough. It's also looking at what type of home that people are looking for. And I think they're going to need to be an increase in some places around particularly multi-unit dwellings.
Councillor Mackenzie. Sorry.
I've just got two questions. My first one is around housing affordability, overcrowding, and housing typologies, which are all dealt with in this report. I don't see any mention of tiny houses. And I know that other areas, for example, in Auckland, there's a tiny house village, which is run on a sort of community trust housing model. And I wonder why this is not being used as a strategy around housing. We know that the price of building materials is probably not going to go lower. And also we know that it's actually a wealthy minority of people who can afford to buy houses. Many of us are renting or having to find other options. At the moment, tiny houses are not technically regarded as houses, but they nevertheless are being used as houses, and their numbers are increasing. And people are choosing them as a more environmentally friendly way to live. And if they're done well, they can have a much lower environmental impact. With this report, it appears to me a lot of the planning is sort of very what I would call developer driven. It's not focused on fulfilling people's housing needs. And I note that, the regional policy statement doesn't say anything with respect to tiny homes, and it's not going to be updated for some time. So I wonder what mechanisms are available to us to enable tiny houses to be used as a housing strategy. And my other question is more to my Greater Christchurch Partnership representatives. Have tiny houses been raised as a possible housing strategy? Why aren't we zoning and putting aside land for community trust villages of this type?
Thank you, Councillor McKenzie. The housing capacity assessment looks backwards over time. It uses as a key metric the building consents that have been issued to determine how many houses have been built. Tiny houses, by their very nature, one of the things is that they don't require building consent, so they don't get captured in the same way through this assessment. And you're also correct that the RPS doesn't mention tiny houses, and I guess that is because tiny houses are a growing phenomenon that's kind of come together over the last 10 years or so. The RPS was made operative in 2013. Much of the development work was done before then, before tiny houses became a real piece of the New Zealand housing infrastructure. There is an opportunity now, as you have already alluded to start considering other housing options as part of the spatial plan. Not necessarily just tiny houses, but ways of delivering that range of typologies, which may include tiny houses, but may also include small houses on smaller sections, and may also include higher density housing. That is certainly something that can be included in the spatial plan, and we can give effect to that in the next regional policy statement, which you have committed funding to notify in December 2024.
Councillor Clearwater, do you recall?
The only other thing I would add to what Andrew said is that while the spatial plan can address those matters, and certainly affordability and typology of housing is frequently discussed in the committee, Elizabeth, but eventually it will depend on, my understanding is it'll depend on each territorial authority's district plan allowing I guess facilities like, for example, facilities for tiny houses. So that the steps which I would think each council will need to take as well is being guided by the spatial plan.
Councillor Haynes? Oh, sorry, Councillor. Yeah.
Sorry, I had two questions. I did say I had two questions. My second question relates to, it's on page 38. Which is page 63 in these, it's 0.5.9, and it's about occupancy. And I note that at the last census that around 8% of the housing stock were unoccupied in the Greater Christchurch area. And this represents about 16,118 houses. Is there a mechanism by which we could increase occupancy of these houses by, charging higher rates for unoccupied houses? Has this kind of thing been looked at to increase occupancy rates? Sorry.
Not that we're aware of. Thank you, Councillor McKenzie, but no, not that we're aware of. I mean, we can touch base with our TA partners to see whether it has been part of their thinking previously.
Thanks very much. Councillor Haynes?
Thanks very much for the report. It's really interesting reading. Just sort of following on from Councillor Sunkel's question, and I guess again on that theme of housing affordability, I appreciate that the assessment has been done to determine, do we have enough houses? Not necessarily do we have enough houses at what price? And so I guess my question is there work being done in that space to inform the spatial planning aspect? So if GCP were to, for example, make decisions on the basis of not just about what capacity we might need, but on what sort of affordability profile we want the city to have through deliberate supply lever pulling, if you like. Is that work being done? Are we likely to see further reports on that? Or?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Hands. I mean, part of this assessment is based on a demand assessment that's undertaken by consultants, Livingston Associates. And my understanding was last time that they did look at demand by different price points to get a sense as to where that sort of sits across the Greater Christchurch area. And to be honest, we'll need to go back and check to see whether that's happened again and inform this piece of work. But I would certainly think that that should help inform the spatial planning work. So if it hasn't been undertaken as part of this, it would absolutely be part of further work which has been signalled through this. But we can come back to you with a bit more clarity on that.
Great, thank you very much. Are there any further questions? Councillor Mackenzie.
Yeah, thank you. I'm slightly amused that the issue of greenhouse gases or climate change hasn't been brought up, because it would seem to me that if we're planning on making sure, if we're focused on actually making houses available and the spatial requirements for that, where are we giving regard to the report on climate change, where that requires urban planning to squash things in rather than allow them to expand? And I know Canterbury's plan is just to have unfettered urban expansion north of the Waimak and south into the Selwyn. But I would have thought our responsibilities in terms of climate change, and in fact, in the light of the government's proposals for wetland protection, should have a view on that, given that quite a lot of the subdivisions that are going to go ahead in the Selwyn are going to happen in the headwaters of quite a lot of our important wetlands. And any development that goes on in the Waimakariri district is compromising wetland development. Where are we? Where's our left hand understanding what our right hand is doing there?
Thank you, Councillor Mackenzie. I think that this report simply looks backwards as to what was the demand over the preceding period, and therefore what capacity is needed in the future. There is certainly a conversation that needs to occur as part of the spatial planning process by the Greater Christchurch Partnership as to encourage that growth of outcomes. But in terms of affordability, which and in terms of managing the impact on our greenhouse gas emissions. And there's probably, I think I should add in, while we're about we will need to also adapt to a changing climate and a rising sea. And we will need to take all of those elements into account as we look out over the next 30, 40, 80 years, and where do we want the city to grow and develop into.
But those aims and goals, especially cheaper affordable housing, pretty much exclude, well, they tend not to sit comfortably with planning to actually solve our climate change issues. And I guess that's my concern, is that on one hand we're terribly worried about the end of the planet, on the other hand we're planning to expedite the end of the planet as fast as we can, and I just don't see the link up. And I haven't heard any conversations out of the Greater Christchurch Spatial Plan that are suggesting that we're planning to do it better. I'm just slightly bemused by the lack of connection here.
That is the challenge that we face in Greater Christchurch, and I think you've done pretty clearly two of the big drivers that are going to need to be grappled with as part of developing the spatial plan and the RPS change as part of the Kiutuki Tai change in 2024. How we resolve those will take all of the partners working together to find a common pathway through.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, just to follow up from my perspective too on the GCP, is that that's really the basis of what we're trying to do, is to ensure that the NPS on urban development, which is calling for intensification of our urban environments, bearing in mind those climate change, carbon issues, carbon emissions issues, and that's what the spatial plan is all about. How we can go about doing that, and how we can reduce intrusion, if you like, and further intrusion into our greenfield sites. So that's certainly something that's high on the agenda. If there are no more questions, sorry, Councillor Clearwater has a question.
Thank you. One last question. And look, it's really good that this report can be discussed here at this council. In connection with the next steps, one of your bullet points under 29 is exploring further different projections and allocations of those. And so I guess particularly because we know that post-COVID the world is going to be quite different, can we assume, or can you ensure that in fact the potential changes following COVID in population sizes, say, or numbers, that will be carefully addressed?
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Clearwater. I mean, I don't envy the Stats NZ projectionists around the impact of COVID on our future population. My understanding, this assessment has been based on the 2018 based numbers, and that COVID has been factored into it already. I understand that they're slightly lower than previous projections, assuming a little bit more restricted international migration. So the projections that have been considered do take into account, to a degree, the impacts of COVID. I think some of those alternative projections they're going to be looking at is actually Stats NZ is expected to bring out a lower level local projections. So it's taking into account what those might look like. But yes, COVID has been taken into account in these ones.
Thank you, Sam and Andrew. I think their questions are finished, so you can now leave the table. Thank you. The recommendations are on page 19. Do I have a mover? Well, I'll move that they be accepted. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Clearwater. Is there any discussion on those resolutions? I'll read them out, perhaps. Firstly, the committee notes that Greater Christchurch Housing Development Capacity Assessment 2021 was jointly prepared by Christchurch City Council, Selwyn District Council, Waimakariri District Council and the Environment Canterbury to satisfy the National Policy Statement on Urban Development 2020 requirements. The second point is the notes the Greater Christchurch Housing Development Capacity Assessment 2021 is a point in time assessment having regard to current and future drivers and trends, and will inform the planning responses to be considered as part of the Greater Christchurch Spatial Plan. 3 is notes the Greater Christchurch Partnership Committee received the Greater Christchurch Housing Development Capacity 2021 on the 13th of August, and then we're also receiving the Greater Christchurch Housing Development Capacity Assessment. So are there any discussions on those motions? No discussions? Okay. Sorry, who seconded that? Councillor Clearwater second. So look, all those in favour that we accept those motions? Okay, motion's carried. Thank you very much. We'll now move to item 6.2 on page 90. And that item's, the purpose of this item is a report to provide the committee with an overview of the work program for the Integrating Urban Land Use and Regional Transport Program. And that's a program that includes air quality, transport and urban development portfolio. I'd like to invite Jessie Burgess to the table just to outline that paper. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, before we start, can I just clarify the air side of this? We had air reported in the National Environment Committee. Can we get some clarification? Not now, but can we have some clarification going forward on that?
I can answer that easily. It's clear in the terms of reference of NEC, but it will form part of the review that we do at the committees, is just having a look at that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Kia ora, councillors. Through you, Mr. Chair, as you've just noted, the purpose of this report is to provide the committee with an overview of the work program for the Integrating Urban Land Use and Regional Transport Program within the broader air quality, transport and urban development portfolio. This program was developed through the LTP with the focus of the program on integrating land use, regional transport and hazards planning and facilitating prioritising and integrated investment in Canterbury's regional transport network. A significant part of the work undertaken in this program involves a collaborative approach to developing and delivering work programs that contribute to better transport and urban outcomes across Canterbury. And as you're aware, this includes the work through the Canterbury Regional Transport Committee, the South Island Regional Transport Committee Chairs Group and the Greater Christchurch Partnership. Outside of these partnership work streams, we also have the work being undertaken in the Healthier Homes Canterbury scheme, and this scheme aims to provide support for households to transition to cleaner forms of home heating and to make their homes more energy efficient by installing insulation, ventilation and home heating. And this, as you're aware, the scheme is currently on hold, pending review. We've developed a high-level work program for the next 3 years, and some of these programs are still under development and also form part of this report, as noted in the attachments. For example, the Regional Transport Committee work program, which is a subsequent agenda item. We're also very conscious of the funding arrangements that have now been confirmed through the National Land Transport Plan funding. Staff are working through this funding allocation and its impacts on the various programs and projects across the region with our TA partners. A further update to councillors will be provided. A further update to the Regional Transport Committee will be provided in the next week or so, and then subsequently to council after that. In your agenda pack, you have the table attached outlining the broader work streams within the program. This is a high level summary of the broader work programs. Council has been briefed previously on a number of these programs, including the Greater Christchurch 2050 work, the Greater Christchurch spatial plan work, and also more recently the Urban Growth Partnership, to which there's a council paper coming on the 30th of September. All of these are critical projects over the next year and a half. You also have a separate update on this agenda in regards to the RTC work program. Luke will be able to speak to that in the work of the South Island RTC. This will cover some of the broader work streams around regional transport, including growth, freight movement, road safety, resilience, maintenance and emissions, which sit at both the Canterbury and the South Island level. We're also looking at the strategic approach to regional spatial planning and how this sits across all of our portfolios and programs. This is in the context of the pending RM reform, resource management reforms, and in particular the new Spatial Planning Act and the Climate Change Adaptation Act. So hopefully this is a relatively succinct understanding of the work streams and initiatives within this relatively diverse work program. We will continue to update council on these particular work streams as projects progress. So happy to take any questions, particularly around the table attachment 6.2.1, which I think is page 94 of your agenda. Thank you.
Any questions? Councillor Clearwater?
Thank you very much, Jesse. And as you said, this is really at high level, and I appreciate that. And I'm aware that the item further on is more specific around the actual actions being taken. But I guess that I just wondered, since it's a work program, and it's really just that particularly because one of the directions for this committee is to set the operational direction. It seemed to me that the work plan for the partnership was reasonably specific, whereas the work plans for for example, the Regional Transport Committee and the South Island one too were perhaps overbroad, and I'm just wondering if somehow in future some of that information in the later report around the activities might be able to be brought into this, so we could sort of see the flow of the work plan.
Thank you, Councillor Clearwater, and through you, Mr. Chair. So the purpose of this table really is to provide you a high-level summary, as you've noted, just identifying some of those key milestones. The RTC work program, for instance, which Luke will take you through, is still in development. We only had a workshop on that a couple of weeks ago. So that program is still in development, as is the South Island RTC work program. The Greater Christchurch partnership work is far more advanced, as you know, and so there is a little bit more detail available at this time. So I guess that kind of reflects that even in the subsequent paper that we've got today, it only goes so far in terms of some of that detail still being worked through. So this table here is trying to capture, what is quite a significant program of work, but maintaining it at a relatively high level and identifying those key milestones that we're looking to achieve over the course of this year and into years 2 and 3 of the LTP. So certainly we can take that feedback on board and have a look at adjusting the level of detail as it becomes more available.
All right, thank you. Councillor Mackenzie.
Sorry, Jesse, can you just remind me why the regional rail investigations are delayed until 2023 on the work program?
Thank you. So through you, Mr. Chair. So the regional rail discussions were as part of the RTC work program development in particular. We were looking to develop that and then move into the next discussions around rail and freight movement. It ties in with the regional spatial planning work as well. The budgets in the LTP, from memory, were allocated to year 2. We also have the the Spatial Planning Act coming out towards the beginning of next year, so that we were doing some investigative work into that space. And we've been already having a number of discussions with Kiwi Rail at a staff level. We also have approached the Regional Transport Committee has approached Kiwi Rail for representation at the RTC table. We're still waiting on a response in that respect. Kiwi Rail, in terms of rail investigations at the moment, are only recently been receiving more significant funding. And that's been, I guess, the underinvestment in rail over the last number of decades hasn't put them in a good place in terms of actually having that forward strategic planning that we see in a lot of other areas, particularly look at our state highway network and how well planned that is in respect of Kotahi and the work that they do. So I think we're continually working with Kiwi Rail to try and understand better what their future strategic direction is. And we've just recently had the New Zealand Rail Plan released as well, accompanying funding as well. But that doesn't actually, in honesty, have a big focus on the South Island, and that's one of the challenges I think through RTC in particular, that we continue to advocate for greater funding for the South Island, Canterbury and the South Island. So so that work is underway. We are doing that, having those preliminary discussions, but further work, I think, as we get into regional spatial planning. The importance of rail and road from a freight perspective, passenger movement perspective, and the shaping and growth of our townships will be a critical part of that conversation.
Councillors Southworth.
So could you just give me a bit of information or a bit of detail about the regional road safety working group? I'm just wondering, is it quite a narrow remit looking specifically at road transport and cars and freight on roads, or does it have a more holistic perspective where if you start taking things in like mode shifting onto trains, onto public transport, also think about just the health effects of pollutants from those, vehicles and getting rid of those and switching to cars, to bikes and healthy, does it have that much more holistic perspective, or is it very specifically on the road?
Thank you, Councillor Southworth. Through you, Mr. Chair. Could I defer that question, if that's okay, until we get to the RTC work program paper, because I think Luke will be able to run you through essentially the plan on a page for the road safety working group and actually what that covers in a bit more detail. So if that's okay, or we can pick up.
Great, thanks for that. No more questions. Okay, well, look, I'll put the motion that the committee receives the Integrating Urban Land Use and Regional Transport Work Program report. Do I have a seconder for that? Councillor Sunkel, thank you very much. Well, now we'll open this to discussion. Are there any other further discussion on this? No further discussion. So all those in favour say aye. Aye. Motion carried. Thank you very much. We'll now move on to item 7.1 on page 95 and invite Luke Carey to present that for us. Thanks, Luke.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the purpose of this item is to update the committee on the final Regional Transport Committee and Mayoral Forum joint submission on Hikina Te Kaupapa, which is Ministry of Transport's discussion document on reducing transport sector emissions. I won't go through the whole report, but I'll just briefly touch on some of the key points, and then we can hand over to questions. So the final just by way of note, the final submission is attached to the report as appendix item 1. So to kick off, the time frame for submitting on this piece of work was very short. So the RTC at its May meeting delegated authority to Councillor Scott and Councillor Apanui as the chair and deputy chair of the committee to approve the final submission prior to the closing date. As Secretariat, we also drafted and circulated an 8-page summary of the 150-page discussion document for transport officers ahead of the draft submission, which our transport officers had a window of only 5 days to provide feedback on. The final submission was approved a day prior to the deadline, but the feedback from transport officers on that process has actually been very positive in terms of the briefing that they were provided leading into that window. Our Regional Transport Committee and Mayoral Forum submission was one of 190 unique submissions on Hikina, and it is evident that the feedback provided in that has informed the Ministry's thinking. Several of our submission points were mentioned in the summary of submissions report on Hikina, which was encouraging. In terms of next steps, the summary of submissions on Hikina will be informing the transport chapter of the National Emissions Reduction Plan, or the NERP, which the government intends to consult on in October. And we've offered to review the transport chapter of this and liaise with the Mayoral Forum Secretariat and other council staff on this piece of work, which we intend to bring to you in due course once this is more detail is known on the timeframes and things. So I'll actually take the rest of this report as read and open up for discussion and questions.
Thanks, Luke. Councillor Scott.
Yeah, thank you, Luke, and thank you, Marie, also for the preparation of this. Marie, being secretary for the Mayoral Forum, I think done a pretty good job on this, and we thought it pretty wise to combine with the mayors. The mayors are the RTC, so we thought that combined view would have a bit more weight. It wasn't that Tano and I was slacking in our jobs, Tano. Look, can I just draw your attention to the 3 main points, I think, from my point of view, the 56, 57, 58 in terms of the conclusion, and the degree of frustration that we get in terms of talking about the things we're talking about. And can I just highlight the fact that this sentence. However, two pathways will require a transformation of the existing transport planning and investment system for a starter. That's a frustration for us in terms of what we're dealing with now and looking forward. And I guess South Island Bank, your buck, how do we go on that stuff? And 57, the second sentence, we are already seeing examples of a lack of alignment across central government, even with individual policy statements. So there is some frustration and some confusion in terms of the work that we're trying to do in this space, the limits on funding, the limits on consistency in terms of where we are going forward. And I just think that we do a pretty good job with what we're given. We haven't given a full deck to play with. If we had a full deck to play with, we'd have trains all over the place and, you know, no cars on the road. So, yeah, it's a frustrating process. Thank you.
Were you referring to intelligent transport?
And can I just point to clause 52, where Councillor McKenzie thinks intelligent transport systems is employing drivers with IQs over 130.
Thanks, Councillor Scott. Are there any other questions? Councillor Southwood?
Just like to, if you could just give a bit of explanation in terms of the on page 111. There's the working group and the transport officers group, number of groups that have then got discrete areas of responsibility, and it looks quite siloed, but I understand it probably isn't. So I just wonder if you could give a bit of
Sorry, Councillor South, yeah, wrong paper, sorry. Okay. All right. Councillor Clearwater?
Thank you. Just going back to Peter Scott's comments and frustration, I understand that, and I think it's fair to make it point it out in the submission as you have. And I'm referring to the funding not being aligned. I thought you were referring to that too, Peter. I just wondered if and the whole theme, if you like, of alignment and synchronizing of the different funding sources, for example, our long-term planning with the land transport funding and having those coincide. That it's something like, reminds me of the PTOM being asked for reform for years and not changing. I note though that the Christchurch partnership have had some hopefully success by way of having some ministers at the table through the new Urban Development Committee. And I just wondered if there might be a way for the regional, or either the Regional Transport Committee or the South Island Committee too, being strengthened by making that sort of invitation to government as well. It just seems to be being repeated for a long time. Just wondered if that's a possible solution.
Can I have a go at this first? I think Luke or Jess or someone else might want to comment on this. But
go for it. I've just turned you off, sorry.
And we really are driven by the fact that the government has a government policy statement and a National Land Transport Fund, and we take our direction from those things in terms of where we need to perform. And so I think if you look at GCP is a more of a bespoke type of arrangement trying to get a decent outcome. We already talked about UD in terms of making sure that we do the right things in Christchurch so that we get the right results if we line the things up properly. And I think that's what ministers are interested in. They're interested in a whole lot of things, but this broad acre stuff that we have to deal with. And essentially it's Mayor's business that we deal with. We operate as the secretary in terms of that. And the gatekeepers, I guess, Tanya and I, in terms of the Regional Transport Committee. I'm not sure if ministers would want to come to any of our meetings and get beaten up by mayors every time they come, because that's what would happen to them. Luke?
But sorry, you go, Luke.
Oh, look, I don't have too much to add to that. I think one of the things, and this is picking up on the next piece of work a little bit, the emissions part of the forward work program. One of the biggest things that as staff we think we can do is actually communicating the role of our regional transport committee to central government and to our partners in the ministry, because how the whole land transport funding system works. and comes together, I don't think is necessarily that well understood, even within some parts of the Ministry of Transport, let alone central government, and particularly our role in that. So I think that's a big part of it.
Can I just point to the piece of work that we're going to go on?
Yes. Okay. A follow-up really on that discussion was we made a submission on the New Zealand infrastructure discussion document, and I'm just wondering how that fits into the picture of regional or South Island infrastructure, and the implications for that in terms of the RTC to foster any calls for extra funding as part of that.
Thank you. We did have an opportunity to input into the infrastructure strategy, the submission on that. And I guess the key takeaways from that is it's looking across the whole, infrastructure is a really broad term. It covers a lot, and the key themes in that, which I'm sure you're well aware of, we're picking up on sector issues, and not just transport. Transport is just one component of that. So the RTC will have a role in that, but our input on it has been fairly high level in terms of the types of approaches that might be taken, such as addressing potential issues around equity and considerations like that, and making the transition to reducing emissions.
Great, thanks very much. Councillor Southworth, do you have a question on that?
Yes, Lord, to make it a question. Now I've managed to align my PDF comments with my paper. It's a lot easier to see. Did I notice that in 1.55 you mentioned high trip generating activities, and there's the quarry, mining, extraction, so sort of front end of construction and development and the like is in there. And I don't very often hear about stuff going the other way. And I just wondered, how much is thought given to the volumes of waste and how far it gets travelled, and that to me is something that's a really key part of we talk a lot about waste but not so much about it actually being moved around, and I just put it up there, but I mean maybe you can give me some confidence that is actually a topic of conversation and that it's actually really present in transport planners' minds.
Yeah, we've actually been asked recently to input into the early stages of the review of the regional policy statement, and that was one of the things that was picked up on that. And in that we said that we, from a transport perspective, we're really interested in the location of high trip generating activities, but noting that is primarily decided through planning, land use consenting processes. So I think that is something that we have relatively more control over at the local government level, and it has actually been flagged those high level issues for transport.
I think just in my head was the distance. Like I looked on the map at how far Cape Valley is, and it's something like 60k each way. It's just shocking. So that it's not just about how many trips, but actually how far are these things going to? Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks very much. If there's no further questions, thanks, Luke. You may now leave the table. Thank you. Thanks for your contribution. Well, I'll put the motion, and then we'll have the discussion after that. So the motion that the committee receives the update on the Canterbury Regional Transport Committee and Canterbury Mayoral Forum joint submission on Hikina Titu Kohupapara, if that's the right word. Can I have a seconder for that, please? Councillor Mackenzie. All those in favour? Aye. Thank you. Well, I didn't ask for discussion, but do people want to discuss the item further? Councillor Mackenzie.
Just one brief comment about Vicky's question, because I think it's a valid comment, really. I mean, you could argue that if we're worried about our externalities. The Christchurch waste should be processed within its own boundaries. Right? Just think of the benefits that would bring. No, directly within. Internalise. And it was an issue raised in the Wetlands Commission where we were talking about internalising externalities. Perhaps urban development should consider that as a requirement of any further urban development.
Thank you. So just read it. I'm just going to repeat it. The motion that receives the update on the Canterbury Regional Transport Committee and Canterbury Mayoral Forum joint submission. And just wondered if there are all those in favour, please say aye. Against? The motion carried. Thank you. We'll now move on to 7.2 on page 109. And this is a report and the purpose to update the Transport and Urban Development Committee on the forward work program of the Canterbury Regional Transport Committee. And I'd like to invite Luke, Carrie and Claire Patterson to report on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just to begin with, the purpose of this report is to update the committee on the forward work program of the Canterbury RTC. This really came out of the Regional Land Transport Plan, which was adopted and became operative on the 1st of July of this year, which agreed a $5.5 billion program of activities over the next 10 years for the Canterbury region. It also contains a strategic front end with a 30-year vision for land transport, 5 strategic objectives and 3 headline targets for the transport and network that address safety, emissions and freight. While the RLTP is developed and agreed by the Canterbury Regional Transport Committee, the activities in it are mostly planned and delivered by road control authorities, which are our local councils plus Waka Kotahi. And the role of the RTC and transport officers, DOC, yes, yeah, Department of Conservation. The role of the Regional Transport Committee is primarily one of governance and oversight over these activities and monitoring of implementation. So following the adoption of the RLTP, the RTC instructed us as staff to develop a forward work program that would support achieving greater regional alignment with its strategic direction. And in doing so, we've picked up on the 3 headline targets and the key investment priorities contained in the RLTP and translated these into 6 key themes, which Jesse has touched on earlier. These are safety, growth, maintenance, emissions, resilience, and freight. These themes are proposed to become the key work streams of the RTC work program, and each theme will be assigned to an existing subgroup of the RTC or other key stakeholder group to lead, with the Regional Transport Committee proposed to retain governance level oversight over these. The principles that we applied when thinking about this governance and delivery structure were around increasing accountability and ownership of regional transport outcomes, avoiding duplication with others, using and working within existing structures where possible, and focusing the Regional Transport Committee's political capital into areas where it can have the greatest impact. The governance and delivery structure has been developed based on the model used for the Regional Road Safety Working Group, which has a very good-looking vision, strategy on a page document, and is chaired by Mayor Dan Gordon from Waimakariri District. And just to note that the responsibility of that committee is looking at road safety, more specifically. So the Road to Zero activity class in the GPS and the RLTP, the driver education programs, regional speed management and such activities. So we're proposing that the four key groups would have responsibility to develop and deliver a work program for these themes. So safety sitting under the Regional Road Safety Working Group, that's the current status quo. Transport Officers Group picking up emissions and maintenance. The Canterbury Mayoral Forum Planning Managers picking up the theme of growth. And the fourth one here is the South Island Regional Transport Committee Chairs Group. Now, we recently took this program to the RTC on the 13th of September for workshop and discussion. And while there was broad support for the approach in safety, emissions, maintenance and growth, the committee did express some discomfort over the work on resilience and freight being led by the South Island RTC Chairs Group, and sought to retain a greater degree of influence or control over this part of the work program. So we're now considering how best to incorporate and reflect this feedback in the governance and delivery structure. But at the same time, we're also pressing ahead in the interest of time with scoping up and further developing the potential actions under each of these themes, with the intent of reporting back to the RTC on these at their next meeting in November. We've also been asked to prioritise these actions, which recognises the limited resource and time that we have as the RTC Secretariat to progress actions across all of these outcome areas. But as staff, it's been a really important step to look across the breadth of the regional land transport plan and say this is what this success in this area might look like, and then we can delve into that discussion. So there is a paper that will be going up to RTC with some recommendations around those priorities, and I do have some notes on the actions, as Jessie has potential actions within each of these themes, and I'm happy to discuss that further. But I thought before that I'd just hand over for any questions or discussion on the approach that we've taken to date, and then we could potentially delve into that. Did you have anything to add?
Not yet.
Not yet. So over to you, Mr. Chair, and if you want me to talk about actions, then I'm happy to do so.
Thank you. Are there any questions, Councillor South?
I'll ask my question again. That I was too premature on. Yeah, just you talked about the various priorities, and they sound to me there's quite a lot of overlap between those priorities, and one might pull in an opposite direction to the other, and in other ones they actually push in the same direction. So how are you going to ensure that, having put those various priorities into separate groups, that you're not going to lose those opportunities or those tensions, and that can come out with a good overall holistic solution?
Part of that is through the governance and management structure. And so looking at where are the tensions between those issues, and so who then are the best people to govern and manage that. So for example, with there's population growth and growth in the Greater Christchurch area, that's quite big in terms of its impact on the regional transport network. So we had a lot of discussion about, does this sit with just GCP to manage? Does it have to be a regional level issue to manage? Where does this best sit? And we talked to a lot of people about where, in terms of the impact on the network with a regional lens, where does that need to go? And we've landed with the Canterbury Planning Managers Group because there's those range of factors that impact growth, and that growth isn't just occurring in Greater Christchurch. Mackenzie's looking at 10% projected growth. So what's that South Canterbury story? How could that impact the network? And we're all talking to each other all the time, and we are the link between all parts of that as well. So that's kind of the thinking. And by not duplicating and creating a separate new group that's got its own different purpose, but working within the existing structures, and the people are already thinking and already working on it.
Thank you. Councillor Marshall.
Kia ora, and thanks very much for presenting this. So from reading this, there doesn't seem to be any timeframes associated with any of the actions. So when can we expect to see deliverables?
So the approach is to work with the group that gets given the kaupapa, and then work with that group for them to develop out what that might look like for them. So with the Regional Road Safety Working Group, we had some externally facilitated sessions where they discussed, if this is our goal, where are we at, what do we need to do and how to get there, and developed up that strategy on a page. Some of it is kind of we're rolling through already because we kind of felt the gaps and are going to be, you know, the RTC is a really action-oriented committee and they're really expecting us to deliver, and this is really us responding to that as hard and as fast and as best as we can. So, so you know, ideally there'd be this huge length of time and each group would develop up their strategy, but we're kind of building all layers at the same time to keep things moving quickly. So
building the ship as we sail it.
Yeah, yeah.
Councillor Mackenzie.
I've just got a question around. I was just, you know, this relates to the slides that you've got here relating to this. And I notice there is. It is really good to see that there's, you know, working closer to home, reducing the need to travel, that kind of thing. But I note that electric vehicles are mentioned quite a bit there. Myself and Councillor Farm attended a webinar recently on the biophysical limits to growth. And there were issues raised there. Actually, I think you might have been at it. I'm not quite sure. Yeah, there were issues raised there about actually the limits to electric vehicles in terms of battery materials worldwide. And so, yeah, I guess is that kind of on the radar for this group? Those limits may potentially impact some of these strategies here around electric vehicles.
Yeah, and across the transport sector, there's awareness of the limitations of electric vehicles as part of the solution to reducing emissions. So Hikina Te Kohupara outlines those 3 pathways, and one pathway is very much looking at urban form, public transport, walking and cycling, and actually reducing the need to travel, and, you know, shifting people to working from home more. So while electric vehicles are currently part of the solution to reducing transport emissions, they're not seen in the transport sector as such a strong solution. But there's a lot of advertising out there. So for the general public, they're getting that electric vehicles are part of the solution, but the other solutions are still getting developed and worked out. So, but yes, we are aware of that.
And just to note that I think the slide you're referring to, those workshop feedback slides, are from the first workshop that was held with the RTC back in May. So this was a report back to the committee from that workshop on their own feedback that was provided at that first session.
Right, Councillor Clearwater.
And thank you for this, because it is timely and it's good to have the report back. And I think there's been references though to how how all this work can be prioritised, because it won't all be done tomorrow, even we know that. But one part that I guess keeps being raised at the transport meetings is around that whole area of rail. And at the workshop on freight, we came up with coastal shipping being important too. And I see in the context that the different freight companies, like including the ports and the airport, they're all going to be. So it just seems to me, in terms of future planning, especially in the event of, say, for example, more earthquakes, that strong infrastructure around freight, including coastal shipping particularly, is going to be necessary. So it's just a matter of how we prioritise those things. And I don't know, can you just perhaps, I'm just not quite sure what the process for that is going to be.
There is a lot of context, as and I'll let Claire jump in. That there is that context that Peter Scott was talking to before, and that the RTC effectively presides over, but is very much at the regional perspective. But is that investment is driven by the government policy statement on land transport. And if you there you go, and if you look at that, I think there's about 30 million in coastal shipping at this point in time, which was an acknowledgement of the greater role that it might play. But I think, and I could be wrong here, but circa 800 million that's being invested through the rail network investment program into rail over the next 3 to 10 years within New Zealand. So it does speak a lot to the role of rail in New Zealand's future transport network. And I think Kiwi Rail are still coming to the party on that one in terms of resourcing and even resourcing our regional transport committees to have that discussion.
Follow that up.
Sorry, and if I could add to that. So in terms of prioritising and quick wins and effort, because resilience isn't in the government policy statement, we could put a lot of effort in now in this year, developing up working with stakeholders, rail solutions, what that might look like. But unless the government policy statement starts to reflect resilience, that kind of coastal shipping as part of that resilience solution for the South Island, then we might not be able to gain the funding into the initiatives that we get developed. So a quick light touch win with the resourcing we've got is to advocate for resilience to be part of the government policy statement. Then we can start to develop up what those projects might be to get the funding through that.
Thank you, Claire. And my other question was simply like, once the Regional Transport Committee do this work, about when might this committee expect perhaps to even see a draft of that prioritisation? Any idea?
So we're planning to take that to the next meeting in November, and so we would aim to be taking that to this committee soon after that. That's my response. Yeah. And just in response to the rail question before, rail is one of those things that cuts across all the themes. Obviously, we've taken the approach of kind of compartmentalising this work program into different themes, but there's lots that cut across, and even some of our potential actions actually can deliver on multiple themes, and interventions in the rail space would probably be a good example of that.
Councillor Southman.
I'm struggling. I hate docs on tap. I need to go back to using PDFs. I get lost. I noticed that there's on the actions for emissions, there's a comment about building greater social mandate for behaviour change, and I'm just wondering, is there a behaviour change programme or something of that sort that's being talked about? And if so, I know Environment Canterbury is in the mix, so is It's Time Canterbury considered as possibly part of that?
There's lots going on. The emission space is quite volatile at the moment. There's traffic demand management work being done. Travel demand management. I just call it TDM in the office. So yeah, and there's work being done possibly at the national level. There's potential for some research to be done in Canterbury on attitudes towards transport emissions and what people perceive as being what generates emissions, what they're likely to, how they might change their behaviour. So there's a lot. Does that answer that?
Yes, totally.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks very much. If there's are there any further questions? No further questions. So what we'll do is staff, thank you very much, Claire and Luke, for that presentation. I must say that the document that you've got here is really easy to read, and it's really good to see the initial plenary session priorities, and presumably you're going to work around that. So thank you very much. So yes, you may leave the table. Thank you. Firstly, I'll put the motion, and then there's an opportunity for discussion. So the motion that I put is that the committee notes the proposed forward work program of the Canterbury Regional Transport Committee. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Scott. And now, is there any discussion on the Councillor Scott?
So I haven't seen anything up to now, and I just like to thank anything up to now. I'd just like to thank staff for this, because I think it's given some clarity in terms of how this thing works and what we need to do. And if you look at the diagram, well, I'm looking at the Regional Transport Committee with the emissions maintenance, resilience and freight around them. If you look at the right-hand side of that, that's where we probably need to do the work. I think that we're doing pretty good work in terms of safety with Mayor Gordon. Mayor Gordon's into that, and he is doing a good job in terms of aligning that. And as staff have said, you know, they've got a strategy on the page. RTC recognise that the growth side of that really sits with the mayoral forum and the mayors in terms of that. But the bit I think that we need more information out of, and I'm pretty keen to get a governance link on, is to this transport officers group in terms of discussions. And when you see Claire get excited about what's going on in that space, that's those people in terms of those discussions. And the bit, I guess the blue bit down on the right hand corner, is the bit that we have difficulty with in terms of trying to express ourselves as a South Island group in terms of the structure that we have in place at the moment. And there's been some criticism at the mayoral forum about that, which we take on board and do support. They support our position on, the mayors support our position on terms of what we want to try and do. But I think we need to be looking for a mechanism, guys, in terms of how we actually make more out of that, because it is a good link. There's some commonality across the South Island in terms of wanting to get together. We missed that opportunity with the freight tour we were going to do with the South Island, which is a real shame because we were going to have Kiwi Rail there, and we would have had more answers, I guess, to the questions that you might have around rail. The rail is pretty complex in terms of the South Island. We're looking at getting tracks stable so that we can take new moving stock. We're looking at building, or they are looking at building a facility down the hillside workshops down in Dunedin. And that means dismantling the ones they have, trying to find out where they're going to continue with the work that they've got going on there. So they've got a big logistics issue down there. So the South Island is a wee bit messy. So that 2023 time, in terms of us seeing some stuff come out of that, it is probably fair in terms of what we're doing. I'm not too sure how we push forward with this transport officers group link, but we are going to have a conversation next week with Jesse and Luke and Claire about that. And I don't know if you've got anything more to say. I know you've got pretty excited about seeing this diagram, Tane. Nothing. Okay. Not as excited as I thought.
Great. Thank you very much. Well, if there's no further discussion, we'll put the motion. So all of those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Anyone against? No. Motion's carried. Thank you very much. We'll now move on to item 7.3. Public Transport Community Engagement Approach, and the purpose of this report is to seek the committee's endorsement of the proposed approach to further strengthen community engagement with public transport, and just invite Thomas McNaughton to the table. And Thomas, if you
yes,
thanks, Tom.
Kia ora koutou. As you will have seen in the paper in your pack, we are updating our approach to engagement to informing public transport decisions. This is for a few reasons. One of them is that we just need to reflect the latest policies that you have endorsed and make them really tangible for a public transport setting. So part of our thinking so far is about a really simple framework for how we collect and present all the information that we use for decision making, and I'll talk you through that a bit more in this talk. So yeah, it's a really important point to note that we are not starting from scratch here. We are building upon existing policies. So the key ones being the engagement, significance and Māori participation policy, and of course the Canterbury Regional Public Transport Plan. So the RPTP was unashamedly written as setting a customer-centric direction, and it provides some detail on what that really means. A lot of it is about having a stronger relationship with our customers, and that our decisions are based on their feedback. So this review has been a really important opportunity to look at our existing sources and where we can do more to achieve this. So looking at existing customers and other lenses on that through a framework. The other reason why we put together a framework is that it really future-proofs what we're doing. So we can look at all our information sources and sort of look at the reason why we collect them, how they fit into the big picture. And in the future, as more information comes through, we can build it into it in a structured way to give yourselves and the community confidence in decision making. So these are the guiding principles, slightly abridged from what's in your paper, but same content really. So this is what we've used to in our thinking so far. So firstly, taking a really holistic approach to what we do. And so by this we mean that we're taking a variety of information sources and bringing them together. So that includes traditional engagements, but surveys and information from partners, bringing it all together in a cohesive way for you. Obviously, mana whenua is fundamental to our thinking here, and we are, as much as we can, we are utilising existing frameworks, existing forums or groups, and also information sources to pull together in this framework. And where we need specific forums for public transport, and we do, the key focus is going to be updating the terms of references to really articulate where they fit in the process. So there's a really clear line of sight from those meetings to the ultimate decisions that are made. We also want to ensure that elected representatives, yourselves and partners, have opportunities to be involved in the engagement, and we've had some really good examples recently. For example, with the 87 Southbridge service, elected representatives added a lot of mana to that, and we've had a really good outcome. And finally, we like to talk to customers, so that's part of our thinking. So the framework itself is really just a way of sort of looking at I guess some lenses of how we listen to the community. So we've looked at 4 segments or sort of lenses to look through. Firstly, public transport customers, our customer base, the wider community, including non-users of public transport, Ngāi Tahu, Papatipu Runanga, and Ngāi Te Wara Here. And finally, very long-winded one, communities that are either key target groups for public transport, increasing patronage, or those that have specific needs that we need to really focus on in service design. So for each of those groups, which are not mutually exclusive at all, for each of those groups, we've done a bit of a stock take on what information we currently have and where we can, where are the opportunities to do more in the future. So as the paper notes, for public transport customers, we do annual surveys of customers, and we receive a lot of feedback, good and bad, on service. So we already have a lot of information, but there's a really big opportunity to take that further and to have a really proactive program where we seek customer feedback, just as BAU, what's called a sort of voice of customer program in other industries. And there's other opportunities to see customer feedback at other points. For example, if they stop using the service, to understand more on that side. For the wider community, we of course do project-specific community engagement. We've got the Fair Policy Review coming up, engagement coming up very soon, amongst others. And also there's a wealth of research, again, for the Fair Policy. There was some wide-ranging research done, which you will all be familiar with from a few months ago. So we want to take that further is to really embed sort of partners information in there. For example, CCC have the Life in Christchurch transport surveys. It's really good information and provides a lot of really good attitudinal information about public transport and barriers, as well as looking at what else is going on internally. With Ngā Tahu Papatipu Runanga and Ngā Tarawa Here, that's where we're working really closely with Tuia, and we've begun that process, and we'll update you on the approaches there. So finally, we've got some dedicated groups of public transport, PTAG, which is the Public Transport Advisory Group, and the Public Transport Accessibility Reference Group, as well as some other ECAN-wide groups such as the Youth Ropu. So the action for us there is to really work with the participants of those groups and to tighten up the terms of reference. So as I say, it's really clear what the line of sight is from those meetings to the ultimate decisions, and that it's really clear how those groups input complements all the other parts that we have here. So it's not the be all and end all, but it's all very important. So that's where we're at currently. So the next steps are really to flesh this out and to talk to a large number of groups, including the existing members of our reference groups, and to have a lot more detail in there. So that's over the coming months, as well as piloting a Voice of Custom program for Metro customers. It's probably good time to pass it over. Thank you.
Thanks, Thomas. That's really good. So questions for clarification, Councillor Haynes?
Just noting in your, and I should have asked this the other day, but just noting in when you've got key segments within the framework and you've got wider community, including non-users, is there an intention to speak with or provide information to the likes of residents associations, community groups within that wider public piece, or would they be left out, or where are we at that? Where would they fit within that framework?
So community groups would be sort of in the last part. Residents associations, that's a good question. We'll put more thought into that.
Councillor Mackay?
Mike, thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is building on that, and it goes back to the wider community. And I was thinking of community boards, particularly from my experience in my constituency, the Waimakariri district. There, and I think it applies probably in Selwyn and Christchurch as well, there is a significant amount of funds that comes from areas which well, it certainly does in Waimakariri, and I think it does in Selwyn. A contribution from people that don't have, easy access to public transport, and it is causing quite a bit of angst. It's something that I've continually get conversations about or calls about from constituents, and so it's how what I've seen about past engagement. It's been very focused on the customer and the people that are engaged in on bus routes and things like that. But we're actually forgetting, for example, in the Waimakariri, where 15% of the funds for the Waimakariri PT service comes from rural, and they don't get, well, then nothing seems to hit their radar about these sorts of discussions. And I think it's really important that some consideration is given to how that might occur.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that feedback. I know that's where it's vital when we do strategic consultation that we are as inclusive and inclusive as possible. And yes, with specific queries, we're happy to work with you on speaking to community boards, etc.
Councillor Mackenzie.
Yeah, have you given much thought to how something like a people's panel could be used for this kind of comms and engagement? Other councils use people's panels for various, for certain, not everything, but for just certain types of engagement. And they can be good for engaging with people who don't have time to write, to give lots and lots of feedback, but might not otherwise be engaged with us. So, yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, so one thing we will do more of is working with TCC on their Life in Christchurch panel. But yeah, generally I'm aware of the People's Panels developments here, and we'll work with an engagement team on that. In other industries, it's worked really well. It's having that option to be really agile, take questions out, and have people a group ready made to go to.
Councillor Clearwater.
Thank you, Thomas. Just at different times, of course, PTAG, Public Transport Advisory Group, has come up, and I see looking at changing that way that might work. So I guess I've gathered for some time that there's been some challenges, of course, with organising and getting regular participants, that kind of thing. So, but equally above that, I see the accessibility reference group, and I think all of us would want to ensure that people with disabilities, for example, that they are somehow represented, so we get their views to how to have good transport for them too. So I'm just wondering, is the plan into the change to kind of like work with the people who are open to being involved, and really gather from them what might be the best structure for like an advisory group? Is that kind of like what the plan means?
Yes, exactly. It's optimizing what we have. So we've had feedback about things like the frequency of meetings, and there's some preferences to only have the meetings when there are sort of meaty topics to go through, when it's the right time for the decision making. So we'll continue that conversation. So it's really about the terms of reference and specific things like what's the best way to, in terms of frequency, to run them to make it the best use of people's time. Yeah, there's definitely a need to have dedicated public transport ones. So we don't see this being a radical change. It's more building upon and refining what we have.
Great, thanks very much. Councillor Southwood.
Yeah, on the same topic as just before, is there an expectation that there will be councillors involved, or an opportunity for councillors to be invited into that group if the group so wishes? Because I personally would love to be involved in something like that, but I don't know if that's the intention.
Yes, the intention is to have yourselves involved in these forums. It's a win-win, really. Yeah.
And then second question is, are you looking with the connecting into communities and key target groups? I wonder if you're looking at big businesses as well as sort of particular suburbs or particular demographics, but whether you're looking at, say, connecting to the hospital and trying to work out something that they might do, or some of the big private sector firms who will be, I'm sure, starting to look very hard at how they reduce their carbon footprint and head towards carbon neutral, at which point I know in some other regions there are companies who are now subsidising their employees to go on buses, for example. So I wonder, are we starting to make those connections? Is that part of what would fit into here as well?
Yes, so we already do a lot of that with the hospital and with particularly central city businesses. It's more on the behaviour change front, but it's all a very similar space. It's about relationships and improving things. So that's, in terms of what the team's doing, that's definitely part of our focus.
Great, thanks very much. Any more questions? Councillor Apino.
Awesome. So we talk about behaviour change a lot, So do we engage with a behavioural psychologist at all, or an economic psychologist when it comes to changing that behaviour of our patrons? And a secondary sort of question is, with our engagement, are we talking to the bus drivers?
So to your second point, that's so PTAG has operators involved, and that should be part of the conversation about how wide the involvement is. But yeah, I agree with the sentiment of what you're saying. What was your first question? Sorry, about behaviour change. Yeah.
We all throw around the ideas on how to change behaviour, but we've never spoken to an expert on behaviour change.
Yes. So before I came here a few months ago, I led the travel demand management at CCC, and that was it's a well-established program, but it was based on best practice behaviour change, and there were a lot of experts involved in setting it up. And this, as you know, there's a lot of psychology behind it. So there's a wealth of resources in terms of best practice and such. Work with Auckland Transport a lot. They've been in the game for a very long time, got some great results. So yes, there's a lot of expertise on that.
Great, thanks, Thomas. If that's all the questions, then we'll put a motion and then we'll have a discussion. So Thomas, thank you very much, and yeah, please leave the table. That would be great. Thank you. A good presentation. The recommendations are on page 147. I wonder if I have a mover for those. Councillor Clearwater, seconder. Councillor Apanui. Any discussion? Councillor Clearwater.
Thanks, Chair. I'm very pleased that staff have brought us this discussion paper today, and it's really I guess we've had some workshops on these concepts too, but I think that the proposed changes are really timely. We want to increase our patronage, and it's, as Thomas indicated to us, how we develop that stronger relationship with our customers. That's going to be the key. And just following Councillor Vicky Southwood's question, yeah, it'll be. I'd also be keen to somehow support those groups. They have lots of good ideas. Bus patrons travel all sorts of buses, get on at all sorts of different stops with different conditions. Some have seats, and I know their city council matters in terms of the infrastructure, but they will tell us about those too. So, and I guess that brings me to my other point, if I may, Mr. Chairman, that when the concept or the idea of, say, having community boards involved in getting their feedback, I think, and as well as the resident associations, I think that would be excellent. And I think if somehow we, if, for example, those residents groups, some of them are passionate and they, for various reasons, but some of the community boards, for example, may well be interested in having an advocate from their board to support the concepts of increasing or improving our bus services too. So I'm certainly very pleased that we've had this paper about the changes today.
I'll just, yeah, thank you very much for that. I actually think we'll be inundated with community enthusiasm all over the place to provide input into this. And that's reflective too of the extent of public interest in the transport space in our long-term plan. And we had submissions from lots of people about route selection, routes not there, all those sorts of things. And just further to what Councillor Mackay is saying as well, coming from Waimakariri, concern in the rural space about the level of service. We have park and ride, so those discussions about with the community and community boards will be really important out there too. So look, I'd like to, those motions have been put. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? No, carried. Thank you very much. We're now going to I recommend that we go into public exclusion to consider the item on page 152. And I'm wondering, do we have the reasons noted there? The public meeting. Let's restart the video. Great, thank you very much. We've finished our business in public excluded. So we now go to item 9, notices of motions. There are no notices of motion. Extraordinary and urgent business. There's no extraordinary and urgent business. There are no questions to be answered. So our next meeting to be held on Thursday, the 2nd of December. And I wonder if I could ask Councillor Pauling to close the meeting.
Hai, tēnā koe, Grant. Hai, nei te mihi kia koutou mō koutou mai I tēnei rā, I tēnei kaupapa. Hai, he karakia whakamutunga o tātou nei hui, tātou nei rā. Kia tau, nā manaki tango o nā me karo ki runga ki tēnā o tātou, kua māhia te hua mā kihiki, kia tua te reo, kia tua te mana, kia tua te aroha, tūturu whakamoa kia tīna, haumi e hui e tā ki e.